Hello, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, and welcome to Inside Israel. It's January 9th, 2024. And tonight's episode is called Follow the Wait. What Leader? We're going to talk about leadership, and I'll share a few stories that have to do with leadership. Leadership is actually a topic that I'm really fascinated with. What makes a good leader? I think it's very much like art. You know it when you see it, but you can't always define it. In my life, I've had the privilege to work with some really awesome leaders, and I've also worked with some who really disappointed me. And even in the Israeli army, I had one officer that I would have followed anywhere because he was such an incredible leader. And I had a commander who I tried to get away from any chance I could because I didn't trust him. And it's, again, hard to define what leadership is. But tonight we're going to look at some stories that really are related to leadership. Before we get to that, though, I want to, well, there's actually two things. First, I'm thrilled that many of you have written in to ask how you can help Israel on a more personal level and to make sure that your money is actually going to these projects. I talk a lot about projects that my family's involved in and neighbors, and you've asked about how to do that. And I'm going to give you the email address of my wife, Dorit. If you email her and just put my name in the subject line, talk to Joel or from Joel's podcast and tell her what you want to do, she will explain to you some of the amazing projects that she is working on. And these are things on the ground where 100% of the money goes toward the project itself. There's no overhead. She's specifically been working a lot with units of the Israeli army lately, helping them get the equipment they need. In a minute, I'll explain why they need equipment. You would think armies should have all the equipment necessary. Why would they need to fundraise for extra stuff? But I'm going to put her email right here in the chat to everyone. So just reach out to her directly if it's about this, not just to say hi, but if it's specifically because you want to get involved. And I thank those of you for writing in to ask. It really means a lot to me that, we're almost at 100 days, believe it or not, that even 100 days in, this is still on your consciousness. That means a lot to me personally, and I think it's healthy for all of us here in this community we have called Inside Israel. Before I get to the main stories tonight, I actually want to start with a question because unfortunately, this question that someone sent in is extremely relevant to news that broke in Israel in the last 24 hours. This is from Michael. Michael wrote in to ask, I've noticed that a lot of the IDF soldiers who've been killed in Gaza are combat engineers. Who are they? What do combat engineers do? And why are so many getting killed? That's a great question, Michael. If you do read, sites like Times of Israel and other JPost and other news-oriented sites from Israel itself, you will see combat engineers coming up a lot. So let me just explain who they are. And the reason this is so relevant is because last night, 6 combat engineers were killed in Israel. Sorry, were killed in Gaza. 6 IDF combat engineers were killed in Gaza last night. They were from a special unit within combat engineers called Yahalom, which means diamond in Hebrew. And let me explain what they were doing, how this tragedy happened, and who the combat engineers are in general, because you're going to read a lot about them. If you follow what's happening in Gaza, you will come across combat engineers a lot. Once in a while, sadly, because of their deaths, but more often, I would hope, just because of the heroic work they're doing. So I'll start out by saying that combat engineers, they're sort of the forgotten combat unit of the IDF. I don't know a single person who requested to be in the combat engineers. You always hear about Israeli kids wanting to be fighter pilots, paratroopers, Golani Infantry Brigade, which has its own aura about it. Once in a while, they'll request artillery because they want to be in a combat unit but don't want to be so close to the action. And same with tanks. I was in a tank unit. Not a lot of people request tanks. As I said in my book about my experience, tanks is more where you end up. It's not where you actually requested to go. But some people do request to go there. But combat engineers, I really have never met anyone who specifically sought out to be one. And yet, they are truly the backbone of ground operations in the Israeli army. Their job is super vital. One way you can measure the importance of a job, sadly, is what's known as expected lifetime of a soldier. That when a battle starts, how long does every soldier, what's the, expected to last in that battle? And combat engineers have the lowest lifetime expectancy once a battle starts. And we're talking about a classic war. Like if Syria were to invade Israel or Israel were to engage Syria in the Golan Heights, that kind of war. And I think the life expectancy of combat engineers is somewhere around 18 minutes for the average. Tanks is slightly higher at 22, and then infantry is a little higher after that, but they have the lowest ones. Their job is to literally build the bridges that connect our territory with enemy territory. If you go to the Golan Heights, next time you go to Israel, I'm going to tell you something right now you may have never noticed before, but once you see it, you're going to be like, huh, how did I never see this? It was hiding in plain sight. All throughout the Golan Heights are these little ditches, these sort of ridges, sort of zigzaggy, curvy throughout the Golan Heights, and they're dug out. So you're going up and down as you would weave your way through them. And the reason those are there are to stop enemy tanks from progressing further into Israel. And Syria has these as well. So when we would go into Syria in a war, the combat engineers would be the ones who literally are getting out, building the bridges so that we could traverse these. And that is why their life expectancy is so low, because they are getting out and they're the first line. They're the first ones in, allowing everyone else to come after them. Now, why are they dying in Gaza and what are they doing in Gaza? This unit I just mentioned, Yahalom, which again is Hebrew for diamond, they're a special offshoot of the combat engineers, and their job specifically is to deal with tunnels. They, they go in and map them once they're there in real time, but more importantly, they blow them up. And we're developing new techniques for getting rid of the tunnels, not just blowing them up with explosives, but also using a special sponge pack that you throw it in, it then expands, and it's like cement that seals it off. We've talked about flooding them. But the most classic and old-fashioned way to destroy the tunnels is for the combat engineers Ya'alom unit to go in, lay a bunch of wire, then come out a safe distance and blow that tunnel up. And so the reason we are seeing so many casualties in Gaza from combat engineers is number one, they deal with explosives. Anything having to do with explosives or landmines, that's combat engineers. And so it's a very sensitive and vulnerable job that you're always dealing with dynamite, TNT, explosives, and this kind of a thing. They're also the ones who are getting out and operating in Gaza to go into the tunnels. And so they're targets that Hamas can shoot at. Now, sadly, last night, when we lost 6 combat engineers, as if tragedies couldn't be more tragic than they already are, it turns out that they were killed because of an IDF tank unit. It was an accidental strike, a firing by an IDF tank unit that killed these 6 combat engineers. These combat engineers were deep into a tunnel and laying wire to blow up that tunnel. While they were laying the wire in the tunnel to eventually blow it up, a tank, an IDF tank that was nearby, fired a missile at a nearby building where there was Hamas activity. The missile hit the building collapsed, hit a telephone pole. That telephone pole fell and hit the wire that they had been laying that was already outside the tunnel and detonated all the explosives, blowing up the tunnel with the combat engineers inside it. And one of the units that Dorit has been working with a lot, Dorit, my wife, is the unit called Zaka, which is the one that goes in to identify the bodies. And she spoke to someone last night who was in Zaka and who has been talking to colleagues who were in Gaza. And he said that they were simply in the dark. And I'm sorry, this is going to be a bit gruesome for you, but I'm going to tell you what the reality is. But they were in the dark, simply picking up errant body parts, and that they had to go back today when the sun came up and it was light to actually try to find more. That in the dark, all they could do was pick up the what body parts they could find. I mean, this was a major explosion. So, that is why combat engineers are so vulnerable in general, and that is what happened last night. Now, as I've mentioned before in these broadcasts, this is not the first time that soldiers, in Israeli soldiers, have been killed accidentally by our own forces. The last statistic I had was that 15%, actually more than 15%, might be closer to 17% of all IDF soldier deaths in Gaza are as a result of these. I hate the term friendly fire. In Hebrew, we call it yeri dutz, like a dutz is the sort of the shorthand, which means dutz dadi, two-sided, meaning you're firing from the same side that you're on. But this number would probably bring that percentage even higher. Um, we also had another incident last night where three other soldiers were killed in Gaza. My sources are telling me that this was also an accidental killing of an Air Force, Air Force believing that it was calling out an airstrike against Hamas, and it turned out it was IDF soldiers. Sometimes in Israel, it's actually not. It's rarely, by the way, it's rarely announced in Israel when soldiers are killed by friendly fire. Only later on will they say, it turns out that that killing 3 weeks ago of an IDF soldier happened because of friendly fire. I'm actually sort of surprised that they released it so quickly, what happened last night with the 6 soldiers, but I think the incident was so huge to have 6 soldiers lost at once that they sort of felt obligated to get to the bottom of the story and release the news as soon as possible. But right now we're looking at between 17, 18% of all IDF deaths in Gaza being as a result of what we would call friendly fire, accidents from our own side. A lot of this, by the way, just has to do with simple fatigue. It's not just firing that soldiers have died in Gaza, gunfire and missiles. It's that they've been run over by tanks and other heavy vehicles. Um, they entered areas where they were told beforehand not to enter and accidentally wandered into those fire zones. So a lot of it is simply the fatigue and doing things that maybe you're supposed to do, but your brain isn't functioning as well. When I was a tank soldier, they gave us a list of about 150 rules that as a tank soldier, you can never do these things. And some of them sound so silly that you would think, why would anyone ever do these things? But they also told us that every one of these rules came about because someone had done this. So rules like never go to sleep underneath a tank. I can see why soldiers would do that. When you're out in the hot sun and you're in a tank unit, there's no better place to sleep than underneath a tank in the shade. But soldiers have gone to sleep under tanks and then got run over when that tank started moving. So one of the rules is don't sleep inside a tank. Another rule is never stick your head out of the turret in a tank until you've verified with all the other members of the crew that they will not rotate the turret. Sadly, there have been soldiers whose heads were chopped off when the tank rotated and they didn't realize that one of their fellow tank soldiers had his head out. So every one of these rules we have, it's because they happened before. And the fatigue of being in a battle zone and not sleeping well and not sleeping properly adds to the likelihood of these accidents happening. One last word about the combat engineers is I'll say I do not think that they get the credit they deserve. Paratroopers get a lot of credit. If you think of that iconic photo of paratroopers at the Western Wall, we all know paratroopers because of that photo of those three guys standing at the Kotel, entering Jerusalem and then coming to the Western Wall. The Air Force, obviously, everyone holds Israel's Air Force in high esteem, and other units like Golani and even tanks has real history behind it, but no one really knows much about combat engineers. They're sort of forgotten, I think discarded. If you do see them in Israel, you can tell which unit a soldier is in by the color of their beret. The gray beret, as we call it in Hebrew, kesef, which means silver. The silver berets, those are combat engineers. So if you are going to Israel, and more of you are emailing me, telling me that you are going, and you see one of those gray berets, tell them that you appreciate what they're doing and that you actually know who they are. All right. Let's go on to our first story tonight about leadership. So Herzi Halevi, who is the chief of staff of the IDF, announced this week that he is starting a probe right now to investigate the IDF and its role in October 7th, specifically how October 7th was able to happen. Just to recap things I've told you in the past, we had a lot of intelligence. The question is not how did we miss this? It's why did we not pay attention, and why did we not pay attention to the mountains of intelligence we had? And just to review some of it, We had Tatzpitaniyot. These are the female observers who sit along all of Israel's borders, watching television screens, monitoring the enemy. And they reported for several months that they were seeing unusual activity, pretty much dress rehearsals for what was going to happen on October 7th. They saw Hamas approaching the border fence numerous times. Anytime they reported it to their higher officers, it was usually dismissed as, don't worry about it, it's under our control, and sometimes even told that it's a fantasy, there's nothing to worry about. The high-level intelligence unit 8200 discovered a document called Jericho Wall this summer, which pretty much was the game plan, the entire game plan for October 7th. When they reported it, they were told it was Fantasia. This was a female officer. And again, I mentioned before that all those observers on the border, Tatzpitaniyot, are also women. So a lot of the story here we're starting to wonder is there sexism involved? Is this male chauvinist Israeli army not paying attention as it should to the women who do important jobs but who get ignored anyway? We had a new piece of news come out that the former head of the Southern Command, this is the army officer in charge of the entire south of Israel. In November 22, he reported that something was going to happen, and the details he gave were pretty much what happened on October 7th. His name is Major General Eliezer Toledano, and he came up with a plan. He had a 3-point plan for how we should strike Hamas ahead of time, preemptively, to make sure that an incident like we now know happened on October 7th would not happen. But he was ignored. There were meetings, and he petitioned a number of times. Even after he was ignored, he wrote 2 letters, sent it up the chain of command. But alas, nothing was done about it. So we're learning more and more that there were errors, not in gathering the intelligence, but in utilizing it. And so the chief of staff of the IDF announced this week that we are going to have a small panel investigate the IDF's role. Now, this is not the government's role. He's not investigating Netanyahu. It's specifically the IDF and the mistakes they made. And I think this is an example of good leadership. Many are saying it's too early. Some are saying it's too late, that we should have done this on October 10th. But I think that was too soon. But I think to wait any longer would have been just kicking the can down the road. So I think this is an example of what leadership truly is, especially because it's widely assumed that Herzi Halevi is going to be found at fault. He's basically appointing a commission to investigate the IDF that he was in charge of, and the buck stops with him. So he's appointing a commission to come to the conclusion that he was at fault too. I may remind you, those of you who've been with me from the beginning, that on October 6th, in the middle of the night, Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff, had a number of phone calls with other officers in the IDF, with the Shin Bet, the Internal Security Service. They heard strange things coming out of Gaza. They got intelligence that things were about to happen, but they decided it wasn't serious. They decided to have another phone call in the morning, and by then it was too late. It's widely assumed in Israel that he is going to have to step down after the war, and he recognizes this. And despite the fact that this is his future, he's appointing this commission anyway. So I think this is an example of exactly the kind of leadership that Israel needs. He did apologize, by the way. Herzi Halevi did face the cameras and say and apologize, and he said, now it's time for the IDF to do what it needs to do. But I, as the chief of staff, do accept responsibility, and that was very big of him. The second area, if we're talking about leadership, I talked about this last week for the first time, Netanyahu. As I see it right now, my vow was always to not be political and to just give you the news, but not have my own political stand. But it became too hard. So after the 12th episode, I threw in the towel and said, okay, now I'm going to tell my opinion as well. I'm going to reiterate what I said last week, that I do think it's time for Netanyahu to step down. And what's becoming more and more clear is it's not just that he's getting political with the war, it's that he doesn't have the leadership he needs to bring the country behind him. And let me give you a few new examples. We had an incident this week in Israel, which if it weren't so sad and tragic, it would actually kind of be comically funny. You know how comedy and tragedy can so often go together. So there was a hearing for victims of sexual violence, specifically related to the October 7th incident. And at this hearing, a member of Knesset named Keti Shitrit, she spoke to the families of hostages. Now, these are families who have family members in Gaza now or who have come out and it's found that they were abused. And she spoke to the families of hostages. She's a Likud member. And she told them that she understands the pain they're going through. And she explained, how does she understand? She said that because she very recently had eye surgery, and for a full week, she wasn't able to see outside of that one eye. And it often would hurt her. She would feel pain in this eye, and her entire life was upended for this week. And so she can sympathize with the pain that they are going through. And immediately she was torn apart in Israel. Just the phrase tone deaf doesn't accurately sum up what that kind of a story, what kind of statement that was. But she's a member of, Netanyahu's coalition. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing that his own coalition members are acting out of hand and he doesn't have control of them. Another example, I told you that Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff, appointed this panel to look into the IDF's role on October 7th. And he assigned a former chief of staff to be on that panel, Shaul Mofaz, who is widely recognized as really a great chief of staff. When he was the chief of staff, he was looked up to, he was respected. He did, however, oversee the 2005 pullout in Gaza. So in 2005, he was the chief of staff, and many within Netanyahu's own party were very upset that the chief of staff, who was in charge of the IDF during the 2005 pullout from Gaza, would now be the one leading the investigation into the IDF. The fear, they were saying, was that because he's pro being out of Gaza, he would go easy on whatever findings we had about culpability on Gaza. He would always try to make it seem like pulling out of Gaza was a good idea, that he would be biased, he wouldn't be fair in his assessments. And anyone mainstream dismissed this as out of hand. They know that as a former chief of staff, he would do his best to investigate. But Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the right-wing minister of police in Israel, and he's visited the Temple Mount many times, basically just to rile up Palestinian ire and to sort of stick a finger in their face. He interrupted the meeting. There was a meeting where they were talking about the importance of this panel, and he interrupted this meeting, Ben-Gvir, and started yelling personally at the chief of staff and accusing him of being inadequate and launching all these accusations at him. I mean, it was so disrespectful. And this meeting apparently went on for 3 hours, where people were yelling at each other, and others in the Likud party and others in that coalition were yelling at the chief of staff, which is unheard of in Israel. I mean, if you have disagreements, that's fine, but yelling at the chief of staff while he's in uniform to talk about the panel he's setting up. And Netanyahu was in the room, and he didn't stop it. And it's another example of Netanyahu just allowing those in his coalition to keep doing what they're doing because he is so intent on holding on to power. Personally, I think he's delusional. I don't know how he thinks he's going to hold on to power and be the prime minister after everything that's happened, but somehow, apparently he does. But he allowed his own chief of staff to be berated during this Knesset meeting. And at the end of the meeting, he turned to the chief of staff and he said, sometimes you have to listen to the ministers, which is another, salt in the wound to his own chief of staff. So clearly, to me, Netanyahu is playing politics and he's lost all control of those within his own coalition. Another example is Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who is the Minister of Finance. They're being very public about this idea of voluntary emigration of Gazans to other countries. Now, look, between you and me, it might be a good idea to consider the possibility that Gazans who don't have homes anymore in northern and central Gaza to live in other countries. Certainly, it's happened many times before that Syrian refugees are now in Europe, or refugees from Afghanistan or in other countries in Europe. I think a lot of countries in Europe, by the way, regret the idea that they brought in so many, but that's a different story. The idea of Gazans living somewhere else, I think it should be on the table. I think it's a possibility. It might be a solution, but it is not something you go talking about out loud. It is not something you shout about and have picked up in the media. and certainly not when Israel is being brought to trial at The Hague for crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity by South Africa. And Israel has decided to defend itself. Instead of just ignoring these charges, Israel is going to defend itself against these charges, which I think is a good idea. But what if Israel can look bad at this trial at The Hague for any reason, it would actually be because of the statements of these ministers calling for voluntary emigration. So Netanyahu, as a leader, needs to tell those in his coalition, you cannot say this out loud. There needs to be a difference between your private beliefs and what you broadcast to the world with your statements and your tweets and your videos. And he's not doing that. The reason he's not doing that is because he is so afraid of losing power, of losing his coalition. I think he's only 3 or 4 coalition members away right now from Likud from him not having the votes to stay prime minister. He'll do anything to keep them. I want to remind you that last week I brought this up, but it's worth repeating that there was supposed to be a meeting between the 4 pillars of Israel's defense forces, which is the Shin Bet, the Israeli internal security, the Mossad, which is like the CIA spy agency overseas, Yoav Gallant, who is the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Staff of the IDF, Herzi Halevi, and Netanyahu would not allow Gallant to meet with the head of the Shin Bet and the head of the Mossad because he was afraid of Gallant saying things about Netanyahu behind his back and interfering with hostage talks. And again, when you're putting politics above the safety of civilians and the safety of our soldiers, that is when I think it is time to go. Another thing that's happened this week with Netanyahu is we've been slowly taking action against all these illegal outposts in the West Bank. You know, settlers in the West Bank will often just go to a hilltop, put down a flag, literally put down a flag and a couple trailers and beds and say that we are now a village. And Israel has allowed this to go on for many years. But lately, we've been starting to dismantle them and sometimes even raze these villages, raze, R-E-Z-E, to take them down. And this week, Netanyahu canceled the raising of one of these illegal outposts. There was an illegal outpost that was supposed to be dismantled, and Netanyahu canceled it because members of his own coalition threatened to leave the government if he didn't, and he backed down to this kind of pressure from the right. Now, all of this is in the context of something else, which probably did not get picked up here in the American media, but I think we need to take very seriously, was that the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, just came out with an assessment that the West Bank is very close to an intifada-like eruption. And the reason is because economic conditions are so bad right now in the West Bank that it could lead to a very violent uprising. And they really feel, the IDF feels, that Israel is on the brink of seeing this kind of uprising in the West Bank. And there are a few reasons for this. Number one is that it used to be that there were 150,000 Palestinian workers coming from the West Bank into Israel every day to do mostly construction work, but other kind of work as well. Gardening and maintenance of parks and sort of the blue collar construction type labor. A lot of that has been done by the 150,000 West Bank Palestinians. A lot was done by Gazans as well, 30,000 Gazans who we found out were spying and going around and drawing up maps of the South so that Hamas could know exactly where to go. But Israel has decided not to allow these 150,000 workers into Israel. And Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, has decided not to transfer tax money that Israel collects on behalf of Palestinians in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority. Smotrich has decided not to transfer this money to them. Now, to be clear, this is not money from Israel to Palestinians in the West Bank. This is tax money owed to the Palestinian Authority that Israel collects, but simply he's decided to hold on to it on the grounds that with so much backing for Hamas right now, remember, backing for Hamas in the West Bank is increased 300% since October 7th. Smotrich feels that transferring this money really would just be funding more uprising against Israel. And I got to tell you, like, this is an issue which I will admit to you right now that I am not smart enough to know what the correct answer is. On the one hand, I completely understand why you would not want 150,000 West Bank Palestinians coming into Israel, because for many points of view, they could be drawing up maps for the next type of attack. And we do believe that the West Bank could be a source of the kind of October 7th attack that happened near Gaza. You can also understand why you wouldn't want to transfer money to the Palestinian Authority, because with so much support for Hamas, that money would go to tunnel building and weapons and militant activity. At the same time, intifadas happen because economic conditions become unbearable. And in a way, we could be digging our own grave by not allowing these workers in and not transferring this tax money. So I'll tell you, I don't know what the correct answer is. One of my assignments to myself as homework for the next week is to talk to some sort of very knowledgeable person who could sort of advise me on what the right path would be. But those are the two dilemmas that we're trying to balance right now. But what's important is to realize that everything that Netanyahu is deciding, all these decisions, it is in the background. You got to realize that there is this uprising brewing in the West Bank, which would mean we'd have yet another front to deal with, because we're already dealing with Gaza and we're already dealing with the North, Hezbollah, coming out of Lebanon. Just to mention real quick on the political front, we are seeing a lot of sinking in the polls, even continuing for Netanyahu. So the Israeli public is not behind Netanyahu. We're also seeing a lack of support, a drop in support for Yair Lapid of the Yesh Atid party. I'm not exactly sure why. I think the reason is because he's urging Gantz to quit the unity government and he's calling for Netanyahu to resign. And maybe that's just too extreme for some Israelis. But the person we are seeing rise in the polls is Benny Gantz, who is part of this emergency cabinet. He's from Blue and White. And I've told you before that I do believe he will be the next prime minister. In a second, I'm going to get to our third little example story of leadership. But first, I want to briefly go through some of the news that's happened in Israel over the past week. So I don't know if you've watched the television show Fauda, but one of the lead actors on Fauda, his name is Idan Ahmedi. He was injured in Gaza last night. We believe it was part of the operation where the combat engineers were accidentally killed by the tank missile. But his father has said that his injuries are not life-threatening anymore. He is in recovery and he is still alive. But to me, this is very much the ethos of what Israel is, that our movie stars, our television stars go and serve in combat roles in the IDF as part of their reserve duty. No one is too good for it. I told you this before a couple of weeks ago, that I personally know of a CEO of a high-tech company that some of you have probably used, he's a billionaire and who's in Gaza right now with his old IDF unit. Noah Kirel, the singer who sung at Eurovision, I've heard has also been drafted. So in Israel, we have this expression, Tzva Ha'am, army of the people, and it really is. It's not like in America where the poor people do the fighting, but those in the upper class, the celebrities, would never actually do it themselves. In Israel, it really is. It really is everyone. Sort of on that note, related, we had a news report come out this week that so far, 9,000 IDF soldiers have requested help for PTSD. 9,000. On the one hand, this is very healthy. 15 years ago, PTSD was not even spoken about in Israel. It's a very macho country that you don't cry at funerals, you don't show emotion, you just sort of be a man, be a gever, and you bear it. So I think it's a good sign that they're willing to ask for help. But it's also, we're seeing what the burden is that this is going to place on Israel's mental health system, not to mention civilians as well. And the statistic I've heard is that ultimately, because of this, we are going to see 30,000 cases in Israel of PTSD related to operations in Gaza or simply people in Israel who've undergone trauma. Saudi Arabia said that they are still open to normalization with Israel after the war, but on the condition that there would be some sort of Palestinian state. This is very interesting because one of Hamas's goals, I've always thought that Hamas's main goal was simply to terrorize and kill Israelis on October 7th. I think that really is it. But others have stated that one of their goals was to dismantle Israel's relations with some of these other Arab countries. And if that is the case, it's proving unsuccessful, with Saudi Arabia saying that they're still open to normalization. But again, on the condition that there would be some sort of Palestinian state. And I actually think this is a good thing. I've said before that I do believe there needs to be a Palestinian state, both some sort of state in Gaza, something in the West Bank. But the idea here is separation. We need some sort of clear separation between us and them. And the settlers in the West Bank, aside from what they're doing being illegal with their outposts and violent, their attacks on Palestinians, it's also bad for all Israelis because it confuses the situation. It causes the West Bank to turn into this gloppy soup where no territory really belongs to anyone. There are no clear borders, and it makes us more vulnerable. So I'm actually in favor of the idea that maybe everything happening right now eventually leads to some sort of separation from the Palestinians and whatever their state would look like. Apparently, the IDF has said this week that they know exactly where Yahweh Sinwar is. Sinwar is the architect of the October 7th attacks. He was in Israeli prison until 2011, I believe it was, when he was part of the release for Gilad Shalit. Tank soldier Gilad Shalit was kidnapped, held in Hamas captivity for 5 years. And to get that one soldier back, Israel released more than 1,000 prisoners from Israeli jails, many of whom who had committed murder, many of whom have gone on to commit murder, including Sinwar. And apparently, the IDF now knows exactly where Sinwar is in Gaza. However, they've also discovered that he has surrounded himself with Israeli hostages, knowing full well that this now cripples the IDF's ability to capture him or attack him, unless the IDF made the calculation that it is worth getting him and sacrificing our own hostages in the process. I do not see that. I don't see that happening. But apparently we do know exactly where he is, but he's surrounded by the Israelis who are there. Another little stat is that it came out this week that 24% of all Americans, not Jewish Americans, but 24% of all Americans think that Israel isn't getting enough support from the US, is not getting enough support. And this is a record. This is an all-time high of the percentage of Americans who believe that Israel is not getting enough support, 24%. And again, it relates to a statistic I brought up a couple of weeks ago, which is that 80% of Americans, when just given A or B, Israel or Hamas, 80% of Americans choose Israel. And we can sometimes get very riled up about all these protesters and college students and college presidents. But the fact of the matter is 80% of Americans do, at the end of the day, would support Israel over Hamas. And 24% believe that Israel isn't getting enough support. Now, I wish Biden and Blinken would pay more attention to this because you keep hearing these two-mouthed statements from Blinken. Blinken said to Netanyahu, you need to stop killing so many Gazans. And it's just so obvious that if Hamas were not hiding among the Gazans, if Sinwar were not surrounding himself with, by hostages, this would be much easier to pull off. But the expectations from Israel are not in proportion with the expectations from Hamas. And it's a shame that the US and the world doesn't recognize that. The last point I want to read in the news is that we're learning more and more about the treatment of hostages who've been released from Gaza, but also those that are still there. As you may have seen, the British newspaper, I think it was the Daily Mail, released photos of some of the female soldiers who are still being held in Gaza with bloodied faces. It is my belief and many people's belief, most of the women were supposed to be released in that prisoner swap. But in the end of the day, Hamas did not release all the women. And many of us believe, myself included, that the reason they have not released all the women is because some of the women, those still in captivity, have been so horribly abused, specifically sexually abused, that they don't want those stories coming out to the world. Now, those stories are coming out to the world. We've had some female hostages this week give interviews on Israeli television saying that they were with women, some of these young women in Gaza, and one was with them. She said, I was next to her as she was tortured. Another said that when they met in one of these tunnels and talked with each other, that this young woman spoke about how she had been sexually abused, raped. And so we're learning more and more about what's happening. This is also why I believe, personally, I don't think we're going to see all the hostages back, uh, at least not for a while. I think that Hamas does not want those who've been abused like this to be out there and sharing their stories. But we are learning more about the horrific treatment that the hostages are going through. And that brings me to my last point on leadership. And I got to preface this because this might be some hard for some of you to hear. I'm just going to tell you my honest feeling. I'm going to be very blunt here, as we say in Hebrew slang, dugri, but it's also a little bit painful too. And I want to talk about leadership in the Jewish community in the US. We have 130 Jews right now who are being held hostage by one of the most horrific terrorist organizations in the world. And I don't see American Jewry doing enough for that. We seem to just be shaking our heads and saying it's terrible, but not really taking action. And I am not in any way blaming you who are out there right now, because by virtue of the fact that you're on this podcast, you are the ones who want to be engaged and who want to know more and who want to learn about how we can take steps. But there is one group I'm actually going to call out a little bit. And if we have any rabbis in the crowd right now, maybe it's not meant for you personally, and I'm sorry if it stings, but I think our rabbis need to be doing more. Why our rabbis? Well, I think of Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel had this wonderful expression, I'm praying with my feet. And what he meant by that, people asked him, why are you marching with Dr. Martin Luther King for civil rights? You're a rabbi. And his answer was, I'm praying with my feet. Heschel was a man of action, and he believed in doing things. And I sometimes worry that we have reached a stage in society in general and maybe among our leadership and more specifically, that we're into talking and debating and hand-wringing, but not enough action. After October 7th, there were a number of high-profile rabbis in the US. And there are now high-profile rabbis. They're sort of, I wouldn't say famous, but they're high-profile. They have a name for themselves. They're known. And after October 7th, they were on podcasts. And they were often speaking about the occupation and things Israel might have done better to at least recognize that there were trouble brewing in Gaza, and very thoughtful comments. But I tell you, Abraham Joshua Heschel never would have gotten on a podcast and spoken about that. He probably wouldn't have gotten on a podcast at all. I think he would have just found a way to pray with his feet. And I think our rabbis need to be doing more. I think our rabbis need to be thinking of coming up with concrete action steps that we should be doing on many levels, but number one, to release the 130 Jews who are being held captive. And it's just become too much a part of our daily lives that we have 130 hostages in Gaza. And I'm not saying daily life should stop. I mean, I'm touring, I'm speaking, I'm even performing comedy. Life does have to go on, but I think we need to be doing more to call for their release. And I don't think it's necessarily the heads of JCCs and federations, it's the rabbis, the ones with that spiritual element to them, who need to be leading the charge. So I think there's a little gap in the leadership here. I would love to hear your opinion on this. You can put it in the chat, although the chat will disappear after the Zoom. You can email me, as always, joel@joelchasnoff.com. But I would love to hear. You might totally agree with me, or you might think that I'm off the wall and making accusations that leveling accusations that aren't deserved. But I really would like to hear what you think. But that is my opinion. Before we conclude, there's a couple more questions. You have some questions in the chat, which I want to get to, and I'm going to read a couple of questions that were sent in. Okay, so Roberta asked, what's happening to stop settlers from attacking Palestinians in the West Bank? Why are they not arrested? This is awful, and it just fans the hatred. Roberta, I couldn't agree with you more. I think they do need to be arrested. It is awful. It fans more hatred for Israel. Why is nothing happening? It's because Netanyahu does not want to displease those on the far right in his coalition. If Netanyahu goes after the settlers in the West Bank, it will upset those in his coalition. They could quit the government and he would no longer be prime minister. That is why he is not reining them in. Also, Netanyahu's really his whole ethos is that there should never be a state, a Palestinian state in the West Bank. He propped up Hamas, sent lots of money to Hamas over the years, overlooked what Hamas is doing, thinking Hamas would be an asset, that the stronger Hamas was, the weaker the chances for a state, a Palestinian state in the West Bank would be. So you just understand where he's coming from. Palestinian state in the West Bank is the worst thing that could happen to Israel in his mind, and so he lets the settlers run wild. But that's the reason why. Robert asked, we're now seeing, and this is true, there's now a new GoPro camera footage of what happened on October 7th. Robert asked, after watching the new footage of what happened on October 7th, the way Hamas broke through the fence, I want to know, does Israel use force field technology in protecting its borders? And I don't know exactly what that means, but I can assume that what Robert means is sort of lasers and some sort of, if you see in movies when people sneak through houses, there's security systems, there's lasers coming through blocking them, some sort of force field that would alert us when enemies are coming in Israel, not just a fence, but some sort of monitor, some sort of alarm. I don't know. I don't know if Israel has used force field technology or can or would. What I do know is this. At the real root of October 7th and the failure of our intelligence October 7th, at the root of it all was not fences not being strong enough. It wasn't that our binoculars didn't see far enough. It was that we were deluded into believing it couldn't happen. We simply couldn't imagine that Hamas would have the gall, the cojones, right? In Hebrew, the beitzim to pull it off. And we didn't think they were actually capable, and we didn't think they wanted to. None of the technology in the world helps if you actually don't believe that your enemy is going to attack. It makes me think about, I know people who leave their houses unlocked at night because they are convinced that no one will break into their house because they live in such and such a neighborhood in such and such a place. And in a way, Israel kind of had that mentality. There was just simply no way it could happen. So there was no need to even come up with a plan. As I've told you before, when this summer we discovered Jericho Wall, that whole plan for how Hamas was going to come into Israel with hang gliders and through the fence and what have you, with jeeps and motorcycles. Not only was that plan dismissed as fantasy, but we didn't even come up with a plan to counter it in case. It was so delusional. We were so deluded that we didn't even bother to come up with a response. So in a way, force field technology wouldn't make a difference at that point. Okay, a lot of questions here. We have a few minutes. I will try to run through it. Someone mentioned rabbis protesting today against, yes, there are rabbis for ceasefire, I believe that they're called. Man, I'm so against this idea. Look, I'm a peace-loving guy. I don't love guns and violence, but if you're a rabbi, your duty is to the Jewish people. And I see all these rabbis who are part of Ceasefire for Peace or Jews. There's another one, Jews for JFP or whatever it's called. I think we've entered an age where a lot of rabbis are more concerned with their social profiles and how they're perceived and their popularity than they are with their mission to be a spearhead for the Jewish people. This is me talking completely honestly and possibly shooting myself in the foot. But I believe, these rabbis, there are other things they can do if they're not happy with what's going on. But why are you a rabbi if you're not going to even stand up for the number one cause that you've been ordained to stand up for, which is the continuity of the Jewish people themselves? Who does Israel expect to be in leadership in Gaza when Hamas is destroyed? Well, this is from my good friend Harold. It's a good question. Israel this week was supposed to have a meeting talking about the day after, but Netanyahu postponed this meeting for political reasons of who he didn't want in that meeting. So we still don't know what Israel's plan is. We've heard different things over the past 2 weeks. Some have been saying that the Palestinian Authority actually will have some sort of control in Gaza. Some have said that it might be a technocratic government in Gaza of sort of Palestinian elites, as opposed to Abbas, who is in the 18th year of his 4-year term. I think more and more, though, the world is realizing that what's happening right now in Gaza is not isolated to Israel and Gaza, and that it needs to be some sort of state-like solution, and that Hamas cannot be left in power. So if there's anything bright that comes out of this, I think it is that recognition that some sort of leadership needs to be there. Maybe a combination of international forces, a little bit of Israeli security, some sort of Palestinian buy-in. But Israel, if you're asking, yes or no, does Israel have a plan? The answer is no. So far, not. Let me see. A lot of statements here. So someone asked why Prime Minister Netanyahu's son is in Miami and not fighting with the IDF in Israel. That's an anonymous person just to me, so I won't say their name. Great question, but maybe an easy answer. Yair I think his name is Yair. Netanyahu was sent, I think he was sent away. He was tweeting and posting these things that were really not conducive to Israeli unity for the past 9 months. He was saying insulting things on his social profiles. He became a liability for the Netanyahu family themselves. And as far as I know, they sent him overseas. And I heard also that he's partying in nightclubs in Miami. So when I said that it's Tzva Army of the People, I guess that doesn't include anyone. But it's yet another example of how I think Netanyahu is not the right leader for us right now. Someone asked a great question. I'm sorry I wasn't clear about this. This person asked, are these illegal outposts that I mentioned in the West Bank, are those Jews or Palestinians? Those are Jewish outposts. So a small group of Jewish settlers will go to a hilltop, put a flag, put a few beds in the caravan, and say we're now a settlement. And now IDF soldiers are responsible for protecting them. And we need to have security forces coordinated with the Palestinian Authority to guard them. And it's just such a hassle, so much of a drain on our economy, on our manpower in the army to protect these few settlers here and there. It also breaks up the West Bank. And let's be honest, if you're Palestinian in the West Bank, life is very hard. There's no continuity. So you're here and your brother is in this village here, but it's Israeli territory in between. At one point, I'm going to do a session just on the West Bank so we can really understand what occupation means, why some people make the claims that there's apartheid, which I don't agree with, but we should at least address what they're talking about so we can understand the arguments. What exactly is happening in the West Bank? But the lack of continuity, contiguity, is one of the big factors there. And these settlers are one of the reasons. And another reason I think they need to be pulled out. Someone recommended the book Pumpkin Flowers. I don't remember what I was saying that she recommended it, but yes, that's an excellent book. Pumpkin Flowers by, I think, Mati Friedman is the author, but it's about the story of Israeli soldiers in Lebanon, but it talks a lot about the, I think some friendly fire incidents and other incidents that I alluded to today. And at the beginning of this, everyone was just saying where they are from. So that's really great that we have so many people from all over the world. All right. So thank you for joining tonight. As always, I end with a few links that will help you out. If you want to participate in these live broadcasts and you don't already know, you go to my website, which is joelchasnoff.com, and you sign up for my newsletter, Hebrew is Magic. And when you get that newsletter, it has the link to these. Also, these recorded. I record every one of these sessions I do with you. I'm going to start posting the video on my website as well. Right now, it's only on my YouTube channel, but you can listen to it on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify Podcasts. And I just put those links in the chat right now. I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Please send your questions ahead of time. I think that we're getting a rhythm here of how these conversations are going to go. Sending in questions certainly helps a lot. Another newsletter will be going out in 2 days on Thursday with the links to next week's conversation, which once again will be Tuesday night at 8:00 p.m. Eastern time. And again, I'll put my email address here that if you want to email me directly, because I really do want to hear what you think about what I said about rabbis and stepping up the leadership, email me at joel@joelchasnoff.com. For some reason, it's not a linkable email address. You'll have to actually copy paste that, but it's easy to remember. And again, I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to talk to Dorit about some of her on-the-ground projects that you could get involved with, her email address is right there. I'm going to leave this chat up for a little bit, even though my camera is going to go off. You can chat amongst yourselves. You can unmute yourselves. I might not have allowed you to unmute yourselves, but now I'm going to allow it so you can talk to each other. Thanks so much for coming out, for joining me. Once again, so great to have a big group here, and I'll see
Joel,
you.
I'm wondering what the rabbis can do.
Stay tuned, because next week we'll talk about that, right? I'm going to punt and talk to some rabbis before then. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
He is terrific.
תודה רבה. Thank you. So Joel, are you still there? Where's Joel?
He's gone. But
Oh.
is Joan Molchansky there? I think I went to Israel with you over 50 years ago. Joan, are you still there?
I'm there. Hi, Judy.
Did you go to Israel with the JCCs?
I did.
Oh my gosh. That's over
And you
55
did you leave? You left before.
Hey, and just
we
so
did.
everyone knows, I'll leave this chat open for 2 more minutes, but then I am going to shut it down.
I didn't leave early.
Oh, okay. You didn't leave her. Alan's right here too.
Oh my gosh. Wait, where are you? I
Yeah,
can't
we
see
see
you.
Vicky. Remember Vicky? We see Vicky
Yes.
sometimes. Yeah, Vicky's still
Oh
in
my
Israel.
gosh. Oh, she stayed.
Yeah, she married a kibbutznik and she's there.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Well,
We haven't
were,
seen. Yeah, and remember Debbie?
yes.
Debbie Roger.
Yes.
She's in Florida.
Hi, Charlotte.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it was
Where are you?
Becky.
Where are
and
you? Where are you?
I'm in Denver, Colorado.
Oh, we're in Minneapolis.
Okay. And I'm pretty sure that Becky and John got divorced. Remember, they were the ones that left
Really?
together.
They were in Madison. We saw them a number of years ago.
Are they still together?
Well, they were years ago,
That's
like 20 years ago,
That's
but
20
I don't know
years
if they're
ago.
still together now.
Okay. Well, they left the program because they were okay. Wonderful.
Yeah, no. We saw them. John was working for the city of Madison and Becky was working as a social worker also. But we haven't been in
Oh.
touch with them since then.
Oh my gosh. I saw your name and I thought it's got to be you. And I was going to email Joel and ask if he knew who you were.
That's so funny. Joel probably doesn't remember me. We've met. He and we have met, but
I
Yeah,
met
we
Joel
moved-
before he was born. I'm friends with his mom and dad.
that is hysterical. We moved here 2.5 years ago because our grandkids are here. We were living in
Where did-
St. Louis for a number of years.
How
We
many
live
ch-
in the Twin Cities,
How many
Minneapolis.
children do you have?
We have 2 boys and 4 grandchildren.
Mazel tov. That's
How
wonderful.
about you?
No, I didn't get married till I was 51. So we've been married for what, 26, 27 years now. And we were together for 5 years before that. I don't have children.
And
No,
you're not from Denver, are you?
no, I'm from Milwaukee originally.
Oh, that's
And then-
right.
And then Madison, moved around with the JCCs and ended up in Denver right after. So I've been here since, I think it's 77.
Wow. Since you
Everybody
got
must be
back.
very bored with us. I'm so sorry. But it's great to see you, and I'm so
Good to
glad
see
it really is
you.
I thought it couldn't be anybody else, and I wondered if Joel would know.
That is
So,
so funny. Well,
I'm glad he-
thanks for reaching out.
Did you didn't recognize my name?
I did.
No.
I did. I saw your name, but your name is more common than mine, Judy Marcus.
Okay,
I know another Judy Marcus.
I know another one in Denver. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I
And
didn't know. if it
I
was you.
think our physical attributes have changed a little bit. I know my hair has changed color.
Mine also. And you didn't have all this.
Actually, I think I did.
Did you go back? Have you gone back to Israel at all?
Many,
Yes,
many,
many
many
times.
times.
Many times.
Many, many times. We were just there in May with our federation. Our federation had a
Okay.
big trip. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was there with Federation, well, 3 months with Federation, 1 month on my own. And then my husband, who was afraid to go to Israel, finally agreed to go. And after 3 days, he said, I don't know why I was so afraid.
That's so true,
Right. And we stayed an extra year in Kiryat Shmona.
I
We
didn't know
stayed-
that.
Oh, yeah, we stayed another year. So we were there a little bit over 2 years.
Oh, I
Yeah.
didn't know that at all.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no,
Do
we
you
didn't go
still
home.
have friends that live there?
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
very close friends that are like family, yeah.
Yeah, I
Not
know.
from that, from our experience with Partnership Together. We have very dear friends in the north.
Yeah, everything is just so.
And in the south, we have a very good friend in Beersheba also, whose father
Oh.
whose father is a contractor and used Palestinian workers. I don't know what he's doing now for building homes. I think everything's just stopped. It's shut down.
Yes, I went through Beersheba and I had always bragged about being in the tallest building there. It's not anymore at all.
Right,
Not
right.
at all. So
right.
I think
Well,
that
good.
that experience is what has made me feel so close to Israel.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
That's good.
definitely.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, good to see you, Judy. Thanks for,
Yeah,
as I
wonderful.
said,
And I'm
reaching
gonna
out.
sign off. And thank you to everybody for allowing us to talk.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think there's anybody else left here. I think everybody left.
Well, I see some people on,
Oh, okay.
not many, but 15 of us. Anyways, take care, stay
You
healthy.
too, Judy. You too. We'll see you
And
next week on Joel's
will.
podcast,
I
broadcast.
will.
Good.
Yeah, if I
Very
miss
good.
it, sometimes I watch it
The
afterwards.
podcast, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, take care.
You
Be
too.
well.
Too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.